To be here again. Nice to see everyone. I don't know about you, but for the last few days, I've been wandering around with this strange feeling that I've been struggling to come to terms with a bit, to be honest. It's very unfamiliar. And I think what it is optimism and hope. It's really is something I'm struggling to get my head around because it's been a while. But, I had absolutely assumed that Monday night's announcements would disappoint again, and we'd be roundly ignored in the various steps that were set out in this roadmap. And I fully expected to be here at this presentation, repeating all the same pleas for support and clarity that we've done to death on the previous webinars. And so, after months and months and months of asking, it finally feels like we at least have some sort of roadmap for the path ahead. Now, look, yes, it's vague and full of riddles, this map, and it is going to be challenges. We might find that we have to make our way through a series of booby traps like those kids in the Goonies. But the announcement, I think, felt momentous all the same. For me, what was as important as the dates that were laid down, because we definitely have to be skeptical about those, but what was as important as the dates that were laid down, I think, was just the tone of the document, the 50-odd page document that was published at the same time. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, I'll cover off some of the points that were in there, because it was just a massive departure from anything that's come out so far throughout this crisis. Just the language just was so much more supportive and had more empathy, I think, towards the travel sector. It also just came across as understanding the particular challenges that we face and the particular nuances of travel. I think more than anything that's been put out before. Admittedly, that is a very low benchmark, but let me just give you some examples. So there were language like that the government were pledging to work with UK representatives in the travel sector. They would be adopting clear and consistent international standards. And on a number of occasions, the text specifically mentions building time into the decision-making process, where they will be reviewing each different step of this roadmap to allow businesses and individuals to make changes and to have a notice period of a week. And so, taken on face value, and this is obviously only words at this point, these are all major improvements, and it's the sort of stuff we've been crying out for ages. And when there are inevitable setbacks on the dates and the timetables, we definitely have to assume that will happen. It hopefully means that we're a bit more prepared, and we'll avoid some of the more farcical scenes of these last-minute decisions and things that we saw over the course of the last 12 months. But there are obviously lots of challenges ahead. Elsewhere in the document, I think we're all scarred really from what you might call false positives of the last 12 months. And so in various parts of that document, there are also some slightly more ominous or slightly more, I guess, cautious wording that we need to be aware of. The whole euphoria of how this whole thing has been presented in the news, it really bears more than a passing resemblance to, for me, last July, when Spain was first added to the travel corridor list and everybody went nuts. And of course, we sort of remember how that turned out. And we have to remember that whilst we do have a roadmap, this government is certainly not averse to the odd handbrake turn or two and maybe sort of spinning a couple of donuts along the way. So alongside that report, the roadmap, it reminds me a little bit of the old "Here Be Dragons" that you see in the old treasure maps. Three kind of jumped out at me. One is that the government timetable is entirely reliant on this idea of identifying what they call variants of concern at the border. Clearly, that's an ever-present threat, and we've already seen a bit of that. But this idea of identifying at the border heavily implies that testing is here to stay, and quite possibly quarantine and hotel quarantine. And so even if we do get back to some sort of normality this summer, which I think is a big if, you have to assume that all of those complexities will still form part of it, and all of the associated costs that go with that. The report also talks about a system of allowing vaccinated individuals, specifically vaccinated individuals, to travel more freely internationally. So strongly implying vaccine passports are central to this. And just, again, another indication of these handbrake turns we've seen, because it was only a month ago that the government ministers categorically were ruling out vaccine passports. They're now are formally ruling them in, basically. So, you do have to bear that in mind. The final point for me was that the decision on international travel will be dependent on the progress of vaccine rollouts, both here in the UK and abroad. And that is really important because, as you probably know, from the data that we've seen so far, UK is streets ahead of other countries around the world, barring possibly Israel, in percentage terms. Phenomenal efforts going on to rolling out this vaccine. But you can see, and I've just put on here just a sample of typical holiday destinations and their latest data. This is all from the central data source of Oxford University. And you can see that these are the percentage of population in other popular countries that have had their first dose of the vaccine as well. And on the assumption that all of these countries open up in the same sort of way that we are talking about opening up, you can see there's a lot of catch up to do between now and the summer if summer travel is to get back to some sort of possibility. The speed, I think, of the recovery of destinations, and we've talked about this before, a slight variation, I think it is going to be related to the speed of that vaccine rollout and the success of the vaccine rollout, but also how dependent different countries are to tourism. So a much more lukewarm attitude in the Nordics and Northern European countries around this, compared to the Greeks and the Balearic Islands, who are straight out of the blocks, desperate for air corridors or bilateral arrangements, and willing to talk about accepting people who are vaccinated before there's any real kind of plans in place. So I think you start to look at what are the impacts of people who are vaccinated being able to travel. And when you overlay the timescales for people being vaccinated on top of that roadmap date, I think we're talking about having all adults in the UK vaccinated by end of July. And so by the time you can realistically expect summer bookings to take place, that is also going to rule out a large part of the demographics, potentially quite a lucrative demographic of people who are lowest down the pecking order for getting a vaccine. At best, it's an ultra late market if summer holidays is what you're selling. But, again, don't want to take away from anything. It's all heading in the right direction. I think when I was looking for evidence of the positivity prior to Monday's pulling these slides together prior to Monday's announcement, there was two things I could point to for this optimistic evidence that there is pent-up demand. The first is this household savings ratio. I think we've talked about this before. It's a measure of the proportion of disposable income that's been saved by UK consumers, and you can see the data there going all the way back to the 1960s, and no mistaking that spike that we've seen over the last year. So if that is true, and the latest data is for the most recent quarter is due out in a matter of weeks, and there's a good chance people have maybe spent all of that at Christmas, but let's hope not. But that certainly implies that consumers have some money to spend. A slightly more recent travel example, I suppose, is what we saw in Dubai at the end of last year. So this chart is an IATA chart showing flights, and you can see, concentrate on the blue line. That was the number of flights, number of people flying between the United Arab Emirates and the UK. And you can see for most of the last year, it was down at minus 80%, more or less, where all flying has been and all travel has been. And then the government announced this air corridor on the 12th of November, and instantly it shot up. And actually, for a brief period of a few weeks, it was trading ahead of 2019 levels. Now, yes, most of that spike was largely driven by Instagram influencers and yoga tubers and most of the cast of Geordie Shore. But these are people who are paying guests, and we shouldn't necessarily turn them away. I think Tuesday and Wednesday of this week really have seen more evidence, certainly in the press, of pent-up demand. It's too early for us to have seen any actual data to sort of validate any of this, but certainly the press reporting is hugely optimistic, even if I do think certain people in the media struggle to get their head around percentages. A 600% increase really is only impressive if the starting point was impressive, and when the starting point was zero or next to zero, it's not that big. But optimistic stories are nothing new. These are the stories that were doing the rounds in January. The narrative in the press was very much that our nation's pensioners were coming out to the vaccine centre, wandering down to the travel agent and making a booking immediately. And that was very much the doing the rounds in the press. What we actually saw, again, the most recent data we've got available, the first 2 points on there are from Barclays spending report. So this is all spending going through Barclaycard. Barclaycard account for getting on for 40% of all card spend, so pretty large sample. And in January, this is up to right to the end of January, airline spending still 82% down, spending with travel agents and tour operators still 87% down. And at the bottom there, you can see this is the January web search data, still, and this is a basket of tour operators and OTAs, all of the sort of big names are in there, still 80% down. So for January, at least intentionally, nobody was particularly looking to travel, certainly in the mass market. And I think that's all the more worrying because that was January, and we know that January is absolutely pivotal to having a good year and to the overall, in a normal year, the overall booking conditions. So the results of a horrendous January trading period, not to mention just the compound effect of the last 12 months, is that many of the travel companies we're working with are running on fumes. I think balance sheets have been absolutely destroyed by this. And I know Adam and I have talked about this quite a few times on these webinars. Number of common reasons for it, which we've covered before, and there's a few listed on the slide there. Straightforward debt drawdowns or borrowing money under government loan schemes. We've got clients who have drawn down on what they usually use as a revolving credit facility, like an overdraft, just to cover a seasonal low period, and have been now drawn on those for getting on for a year. And that's very expensive. It's increasingly unsustainable because they can be pulled at any time. The other issue is refund credit notes really are coming home to roost. They were a lifeline back in April. I am still convinced that that scheme is the reason we haven't seen many more failures in travel. It has helped to prop up travel businesses, but there's no getting away from it. It is now a millstone around operators' necks. There's quite a few that I've seen that I just think are unable to deliver on those obligations and provide the holidays because the money has gradually dwindled away. And so customers are now expecting either a refund or a holiday to be granted. And as things open up, it is going to be difficult. What I think the travel sector desperately needs, and we firstly, we need some extension of the government support mechanisms that we'll see that in the budget next week on March the 3rd. And Adam might cover some more detail on what he expects there. But I think the extension of furlough, the reduced VAT rate, the extension of government loan schemes, I think they are all vital to helping us get back to getting through this really difficult period. But I think something more pressing, or certainly is going to become more pressing, is this need for more equity into the sector, actually. I think lots of people have borrowed, lots of people have built up debt in one form or another. And, ultimately, they're going to need equity to be able to sort of improve that balance sheet for a number of reasons. One is to just keep at bay the legions of stakeholders who are very nervous about the sector. But raising equity up until now during a pandemic without any visibility hasn't been an attractive option or realistic for many companies. Partly that is because you can't get too many investors interested when there is so much uncertainty. But I think that is definitely changing. Even just in the last few days, whatever you think about the reality of the recovery, investors are looking at and saying, well, if this is the start, we want to get in early. So we are already starting to see that happen. The other issue we saw before was that obviously when valuations of travel businesses are so low, the amount of dilution you'd have to take in your equity ownership to raise a meaningful amount of money just wasn't attractive. And so we were having plenty of conversations with people who would say, I would sleep a little bit easier at night if I had a bit more in the bank and another shareholder, even if it was just sort of 15 or 20%. But the amount that they want for the amount of money that would help me to sleep is too big, so I'm just going to soldier on. Now that things are starting to improve and hopefully as that optimism continues and we don't see any further setback, then maybe that changes the dynamics, and it might well be something that people should look at, because I think equity injection really is the only way we're going to solve these problems throughout the supply chain. Right now, the current situation in travel generally amongst the supply chain reminds me of the of WrestleMania and the Royal Rumble. The rules are there are no rules, and it's everyone onto everyone. Everybody is fighting with each other. I'll let you decide who, represented by the little fella in the Union Jack underpants. Maybe he's a metaphor for British tour operators, and it's the regulator hitting them with that wallpaper pasting table. But when this started, it was really the first phase. I guess the first battleground was customers against operators, customers against airlines and agents, and they were demanding refunds. And those refund credit notes did help. They were sort of an uneasy compromise between getting customers, keeping them happy with something, getting them something back, but preventing all of the cash leaking out of the business. But what we've seen since then is the battleground just moves throughout the supply chain. So on a daily basis, we are now acting as referee on arguments between operators and travel agents. Operators are nervous that the agents are going to go bust with their money, and they're not confident that the ABTA scheme would necessarily support them. For example, we're seeing low-cost airlines being sued by operators because, high-profile case being Ryanair won't recognise the legitimacy of the operator and wants to deal directly with the customer. You've got regulators tightening their demands. Lots of our clients are being press-ganged into pushing trust accounts in place and that sort of thing. We've still got this huge problem in the insurance market, something close to market failure, I would argue, where getting insurance bonding, all kinds of insurance, actually, FFI obviously has been a challenge for some Travel Vault members, but bonding, supplier failure insurance, even just professional indemnity insurance, tour operator liability, all of that has become a real challenge. We've got merchant acquirers giving people notice and demanding trust accounts or terminating people at very short notice. So it is a real challenge out there. Equity would go some way to making some of those guys less nervous and would help just prop up those balance sheets. And so that may well become more necessary as we go through this. So to be absolutely realistic, and you wouldn't expect anything else from me from these things, even with the fairest of fair winds and no variant in none of these sort of COVID variants, no spike in the R number when things open up again, no vaccine scandals or shortness of supply, no government U-turns, all of that stuff. Travel is in a really difficult position. I think it's fanciful to expect that it's going to come back immediately to the good old days of last summer or the summer before last, 2019. It is going to take time. I think it's realistic to expect that there will be plenty of restrictions and there's a real mess to unravel. But look, everything looks far rosier than it did on Monday morning, just in a few short days. And I think we should really take that, and that is a real sign of positivity. I think if nothing else, you've finally heard some optimistic, positive words from me on these webinars. That's got to be worth celebrating. So that's all I had to cover off.